You know, we all grew up with fairy tales, these cozy stories of happily ever after. But what if I told you there's a hidden world lurking just beneath the surface? A world of symbols, anxieties, and some surprisingly modern truths. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain, using Snow White as our guide, to see what's really going on in the stories we thought we knew so well. I mean, seriously, take Snow White. A beautiful princess, a wicked queen, some cute little dwarves, a prince. We all know the beats, right? We've known it our whole lives. But what if the story you know isn't the real story at all? Because the version the brothers Grimm first wrote down, it's a whole different beast. It's darker, it's way weirder, and honestly, it's got a lot more to say about our world today than you'd ever expect. To really get it, let's start with one of the most famous objects in literature. Right, the Queen's magic mirror. Mirror, mirror on the wall, you know the line. But this isn't just some magical GPS for finding beautiful people. No, it's a powerful symbol for a moment that happens to every single one of us. Psychoanalysts actually have a name for it, the mirror stage. It's that wild moment when a baby, maybe a year old, looks in a mirror and it suddenly clicks. Whoa, that's me. It's literally the birth of your sense of self, your ego. And you guessed it, it's also the seed of our lifelong obsession with our own image. I mean, the Queen's desperate need for the mirror to tell her she's the best? That's textbook narcissism. But doesn't that sound just a little familiar? Today, that magic mirror is right here in our pockets. We're asking our phones, who's the fairest? Every time we post a selfie, checking the likes, waiting for that validation on the perfect image of ourselves we've built. And that's what's so crazy. A story that's 200 years old is perfectly describing selfie culture. It just begs the question, right? What kind of world created these incredibly deep, complicated stories in the first place? Well, to get that, we have to go back in time, back to a period of absolutely massive change, when the entire world was shifting from a life of farming to a new, scary life of factories and cities. And you've got to understand this key difference. Before we had fairy tales, there were folk tales. And folk tales were not for kids. They were raw, often pretty brutal stories told by adults for adults around the fire in small farming villages. But when society changed, those old stories got cleaned up, written down, and repackaged for a totally new audience, children. And the timing here is absolutely crucial. Fairy tales didn't just appear. They exploded in popularity during the Industrial Revolution. This was a time of intense fear and anxiety. Everything people knew was vanishing. The future felt completely out of control. So these stories showed up to teach kids morals and, honestly, to calm everyone down a little. On top of all that, this era basically invented the modern idea of childhood. For most of history, kids were just seen as little adults. But suddenly, childhood became this special, protected time for learning. And, of course, that created a huge new demand for stories that could teach kids how to survive in this confusing new industrial world. Okay, so with all that context in our back pocket, let's go back to Snow White, because now we can see it for what it really is. It's not just a cute story. It's a powerful map full of hidden symbols about growing up, facing your fears, and finding your way in the world. The story kicks off with this incredibly striking, kind of weird image, right? The queen is sewing, she pricks her finger, and 3 drops of blood fall on the pure white snow. This is not just a random detail, it's a powerful symbol for conception. Yeah, believe it or not, in a lot of old folklore, sewing, and especially getting pricked by a needle, was basically code. It was a symbol for losing one's virginity and the creation of a new life. So right from the very first paragraph, this story is grounded in the raw realities of biology. So the story jumps forward, Snow White is growing up, and then the mirror drops the bombshell. It declares that she, not the queen, is the fairest of them all. And it happens when she hits a very specific, very important age, 7. So why 7? What's the big deal? Well, 7 is a huge turning point. It's that age when a kid isn't just a toddler anymore. They're becoming their own person. They start to push back, to discover their own power, to form their own identities separate from their parents. For a narcissistic queen, that's the moment her child suddenly becomes her rival. So what happens? Snow White is thrown out into the forest. And in fairy tales, the forest is never just a bunch of trees. The forest is the chaotic, unpredictable, dangerous world that exists outside the safety of your home. It's the ultimate test. You either figure out how to survive or you don't make it. Now, once Snow White is hiding out with the dwarfs, the queen comes after her. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And these are not random attacks. Each one is a symbolic test, a temptation aimed right at the heart of a young woman's journey into adulthood. And just look at the pattern here. It's brilliant. First, the queen tries to sell her suffocating corset laces, playing on the desire for a perfect waist. When that fails, she comes back with a poisoned comb, targeting the vanity of having beautiful hair. And finally, the big one, the poisoned apple. The beautiful red side, the side that promises life and youth, is the part that's deadly. The queen is literally weaponizing Snow White's own vanity against her. Okay, but what about the 7 dwarfs? First thing, you have to completely forget the Disney version. In the original story, they don't even have names. And one of the most compelling theories about them is that they're not magical creatures at all. They're a symbol of the grim reality of child labor in the Industrial Revolution's minds. They only help Snow White after she agrees to work for them. It's a transaction, not an act of charity. And the ending? Oh boy, it is way, way more brutal than you remember. There is no true love's kiss. Snow White wakes up because a servant trips while carrying her glass coffin, and the jolt knocks the piece of apple out of her throat. And the evil queen, at the wedding, she's forced to put on a pair of red-hot iron shoes and dance until she literally drops dead. So, yeah, it's a harsh, violent, and frankly disturbing story. So why are we still telling it? After all these centuries, why does it still have such a powerful grip on us? Well, maybe it's because the deep-seated fears that created it never really left. Think about it. The fairy tale became a phenomenon during the massive social anxiety of the First Industrial Revolution. And today, we're living through what people are calling the Fourth Industrial Revolution, a world of AI, automation, and constant global uncertainty. The world is changing at a terrifying speed all over again, and we are all feeling that same anxiety. Back then, people needed stories to help them process a scary, unpredictable new world. They needed stories to teach their kids how to navigate it, and to give them a little shred of hope that you could make it through the dark forest and come out okay on the other side. You have to ask, are we really so different today? Ultimately, these old tales stick around because they talk about things that are fundamentally human: growing up, jealousy, finding your way in a dangerous world, and that constant battle with our own vanity. Which leaves us with one final big question to think about. In this anxious age of our own, what new stories are we going to tell? What will be the fairy tales of our time? So you think you know Cinderella or Little Red Riding Hood? Well, let me tell you, the versions most of us grew up with, they're just pale, sanitized shadows of what they used to be. See, these stories weren't originally meant to be comforting bedtime tales. Not at all. They were designed to warn kids. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. First, we'll get into what these tales were really for. Then, we're diving headfirst into the super grim originals of 3 classics. You know them: Little Red Riding Hood, Jack and the Beanstalk, and Cinderella. And to wrap it all up, we'll ask the big question: why are we still so drawn to these dark stories? All right, to really get a grip on these stories, we've got to start with the most basic question. What was their point in the first place? You know, we tend to see them as these sweet, gentle bedtime stories, right? Just a bit of harmless make-believe. But that's a pretty modern take on it. Their original job was way more serious, and honestly, a lot more important. Yeah, these weren't about escaping reality. They were survival guides for reality. The core lesson was simple and kind of harsh. Growing up means you have to leave home, and when you do, you're going to face a world that is dangerous and uncertain. So to see just how this plays out, let's jump into our first classic story. Okay, Little Red Riding Hood. We all know the basics, right? Girl, red cape, wolf, grandma's house. But if you look just a little closer, you'll see that almost every single piece of this story is a symbol, a code, for something much, much deeper. I mean, just think about it for a second. That red hood, it's all about her becoming a woman. And the forest, well, that's the big, scary world outside the safety of her village. And the wolf, come on, that's a pretty clear metaphor for a predator, right? Even the flowers she stops to pick are just temptations, distracting her from the safe path. The message is just screaming at you, step off the path and you are going to get eaten. And believe me, the original folk version, it's even more direct. Yeah, in the really old versions, forget about some heroic woodsman showing up to save the day. It doesn't happen. The wolf kills Grandma, cooks her up, and then tricks Red Riding Hood into eating her own grandmother's flesh and drinking her blood. I'm not kidding. Then he tells her to get undressed, throw her clothes on the fire, and get into bed with him. And then he eats her. That's it. The end. This was not a happy story. It was a terrifying, brutal warning about what happens when you're naive. So if Little Red Riding Hood is all about the dangerous lurking outside the home, our next tale brings the conflict right inside. Jack and the Beanstalk. It feels like a simple adventure story, but when you peel back the layers, it's this incredibly deep psychological drama about family, power struggles, and what it really means to grow up. Okay, think about it from a little kid's point of view. Your dad can seem like a giant, right? He's huge, his voice booms, he sets all the rules, and maybe most importantly, he's got your mom's attention. So in this interpretation, the giant up in the sky isn't just some random monster. He's Jack's own father, seen through the eyes of a child. So Jack's whole trip up that beanstalk is basically a symbolic quest for power. First, he blows off his mom. Then he climbs up and invades the giant's territory, which is really his father's territory. And he just starts taking all the stuff that represents adult power, like the gold and the harp. And then, for the grand finale, he chops down the beanstalk, kills the father figure, and bam, he's the new man of the house. It's really a story about a kid violently taking his independence. All right, but when it comes to stories that have been completely sanitized, I mean, Cinderella might just take the cake. The sweet, everything works out in the end version we all know from Disney, it is a million miles away from the absolutely brutal story the Grimm brothers wrote down. And the differences are, wow, just wow. In the Grimm version, the stepsisters literally cut off parts of their own feet to try and make that slipper fit. And at the wedding, forget forgiveness, some birds fly down and peck their eyes out. Even the magic is darker. There's no bubbly fairy godmother. The magic comes from a tree growing on her dead mother's grave, a power that's basically fueled by her own grief and tears. This isn't just about finding a prince. This is a story about cold, hard revenge. And, it's this cleaned-up, passive version of Cinderella that's gotten a lot of flack in modern times. It's where we get the whole idea of the Cinderella complex. This notion that you should just wait around for some powerful guy to come rescue and make you successful. That idea, plus the absolute explosion of princess culture as a business, has a lot of people saying that the modern version of the story pushes a really outdated and frankly unhelpful fantasy onto young girls. So all of this brings up a huge question, right? If the original stories were so violent and, well, so disturbing, why on earth do we keep telling them? What is it about us that seems to need these dark stories? Well, it turns out these stories are incredible psychological tools. Think about it. It's way easier for a kid to be scared of a wicked stepmother than it is to deal with the confusing fact that their own mom, who they love, can sometimes be angry or scary. These stories basically give a name and a face to these really complicated fears. It lets kids work through them in a safe, symbolic space. And they teach a crucial lesson, that even when things are at their absolute worst, you can be resilient, that even the biggest, scariest monsters can actually be beaten. So in that way, the stories weren't meant to traumatize kids at all. They were meant to immunize them. And that's such a powerful lesson, isn't it? These stories were like training manuals for childhood. They taught us that giants can fall and that wolves can be trekked. So the question that lingers for all of us is, how do we take those same lessons about being brave and resilient and use them to fight the much more complicated dragons we all face as adults? We all think we know the fairy tales we grew up with, right? You've got your charming princes, magical castles, and of course the classic happily ever after. But what if I told you those stories were never meant to be comforting? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain and look at the shadows behind the stories you thought you knew. I mean, really think about it. What if these stories we tell our kids, what if they weren't fantasies to help them sleep at night, but were actually grim, gritty warnings? Like actual tools designed to help people survive in a truly brutal and unforgiving world. Okay, so this really lays it all out, doesn't it? On one side, you've got the version we all know and love, the sanitized, Disney-fied version. But on the other side, the stark, brutal reality they actually came from. We're talking stories that weren't about happily ever after at all. They were basically survival manuals, where a charming prince was, much more likely to be a very dangerous stranger. All right, so let's dive right in with an absolute classic. A story so famous you'd think there are no secrets left, right? Wrong. The story of Hansel and Gretel is rooted in a fear that was terrifyingly real. So the version we all know is pretty simple, right? You've got the wicked stepmother, the dad who kind of goes along with it, they abandon the kids in the forest, trail of breadcrumbs, a house made of candy, they outsmart a witch, and boom, they come home rich. It feels like a pretty straightforward story of good versus evil. But oh man, the original is so much darker. See, this story wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It was a direct reflection of a really grim reality. We're talking about a time in pre-modern Europe that was just ravaged by famine. And this is hard to even imagine. Child abandonment was a real, desperate way for families to survive. And get this, in the Grimm brothers' very first edition, the bad guy isn't a wicked stepmother. It was their own biological mom who wanted them gone, just so she and her husband could eat. So, that house made of candy, it's the most iconic image from the whole story, isn't it? It's literally every kid's dream. But what if it wasn't a trap set by a witch? What if the truth behind it was something way, way more sinister? And this is where the real horror of the story kicks in. The candy house, it probably wasn't even real. It was the lie. It was the sweet, tempting promise that parents would tell their kids to get them to walk deep into the forest. Once they were there, distracted, the parents could just leave them. So the real warning for kids was, don't fall for sweet promises, not even from the people you're supposed to trust the most. And if you thought I couldn't get any darker, well, it does. Some historians think the story might even be an allegory for selling children into servitude. Think about it. The kids escape and come back with the witch's treasure. This could symbolize a huge societal shift happening at the time, the beginning of the industrial age. Suddenly, kids weren't just extra mouths to feed. They could be sent to work in factories. They could become economic assets and bring that treasure, wages, back home. The message of the story basically became, hey, don't just dump your kids in the woods anymore. Now they're worth something. Okay, so we've seen how these tales tackled the raw fear of starvation, but they also dug into some really deep psychological anxieties, especially around things like marriage, love, and the dangers of female desire. Long before stories like Cinderella were telling women to dream about their prince, you had tales like Bluebeard. And Bluebeard was basically a flashing red warning sign about what could happen after you get married. This is not a romance, folks. It's a straight-up horror story about what happens when you marry a rich, powerful, and very mysterious stranger. So here's the setup, the core conflict. Bluebeard gives his new wife the keys to everything in his castle. Total freedom, except for one tiny rule. Don't, he says, open this one little door. So what's going on here? Is this a genuine test of her loyalty? Or is it something more twisted, like a trap he knows she won't be able to resist, just so he has an excuse to punish her? And the symbolism here is just wow. It's incredibly powerful. According to psychoanalytic theory, that forbidden room is a metaphor for female sexuality, specifically infidelity. When she finally unlocks it, what does she find? The bodies of all his previous wives. The key gets stained with their blood and she can't wash it off, which symbolizes a transgression that, once you do it, can never ever be erased. It was a terrifying warning to women at a time when that crime could literally get you killed. All right, let's take that same critical lens and apply it to another story we all think we know, The Little Mermaid. And I'm not talking about the cheerful Disney musical. No. Hans Christian Andersen's original version is, well, it's a brutal story about the incredible price a woman has to pay just to chase her own desire. So the mermaid's one big wish is to get rid of her tail and get a pair of legs. But why? Well, symbolically, it's because without them, she can't be a complete human woman. Gaining legs is a metaphor for reaching sexual maturity, for having the physical ability to be with a man. And to get that, she has to sacrifice her entire identity as a mermaid. But this transformation doesn't come cheap. Oh no. The sea witch tells her that every single step she takes on those new legs will feel like she's walking on daggers. And that's not just some random, cruel detail. It's a direct metaphor for the physical pain that comes with becoming a woman, specifically the pain of menstruation. It's the constant, painful price she pays for her new body. And that brings us to what is maybe the bleakest message in the whole story. To get those legs, the mermaid has to give up her beautiful voice. Symbolically, this is just devastating. The moment she becomes a sexual being ready for a man, she is literally silenced. She loses her ability to speak for herself, her agency is gone. She's an object to be looked at, but never heard from. It's a powerful and pretty depressing commentary on how women were expected to just disappear into a relationship. Now, these dark themes aren't just a European thing, not at all. Let's travel over to Korea and look at a tale that, on the surface, seems to be all about the ultimate virtue. But when you dig a little deeper, you find it's actually a savage critique of that very same idea.
So the story is called The Tale of Sim Chung, and at first glance, it seems like the poster child for filial piety. That's the core Confucian value of honoring your parents. You've got this devoted daughter who literally sells herself to be a human sacrifice to the sea gods. And she does this because some monks promised her that if she did, the heavens would magically restore her blind father's sight.
But the story is way more subversive than it looks. It forces you to ask a really uncomfortable question. Are we really supposed to be celebrating this daughter's sacrifice? Or is this story actually a brutal critique of a society that lets a father's selfishness hide behind the idea of a daughter's duty? An ideology where a noble concept like piety gets twisted into an excuse for the old to devour the young. So in the end, the tale of Sim Chung isn't trying to inspire you. It's an exposé. It takes this noble cultural ideal, holds it up to the light, and shows how toxic it can become. How it can be used as a tool for emotional blackmail, where the older generation basically consumes the future of the younger generation. The story is really asking, at what point does a virtue become a monster? Okay, so we've gone through famine, child abandonment, murder, and twisted virtues, which brings us to the big question, right? Why? Why were these original stories so incredibly dark? And the answer is actually pretty simple. Fairy tales were never meant to be an escape from reality. They were tools to deal with it. What did they do? Well, for one, they reflected the world as it really was. Dangerous, uncertain, and harsh. They were also cautionary tales, packed with life-saving advice. They were sharp social critiques that weren't afraid to question authority. And maybe most importantly, they were a way for people to process their deepest, darkest fears about life, death, desire, and survival. So who are these fairy tales really for? At the end of the day, they were for adults trying to arm their children and themselves with the brutal truths they needed to survive. So the next time you hear the words "once upon a time," maybe pause for a second and ask yourself, am I about to hear a sweet dream or a warning from a nightmare we've all forgotten?